Chapter 10. Mad Treachery. To the northwest of the valley of Opar, the smoke rose from the cook fires of a camp in which some 100 blacks and 6 whites were eating their evening meal. The Negroes squatted sullen and morose, mumbling together in low tones over their meager fare. The whites, scowling and apprehensive, kept their firearms close at hand. One of them, a girl, and the only member of her sex in the party, was addressing her fellows. "We have Adolphe's stinginess and Esteban's braggadocio to thank for the condition in which we are," she said. The fat bloober shrugged his shoulder. The big Spaniard scowled. "For why?" asked Adolphe. "Am I to blame?" "You were too stingy to employ enough carriers. I told you at the time that we ought to have 200 blacks in our party, but you wanted to save a little money. And now what is the result? 50 men carrying 80 pounds of gold apiece, and the other carriers are overburdened with camp equipment. While there are scarce enough left for Askari to guard us properly, we have to drive them like beasts to make any progress, and to keep them from throwing away their loads, and they are fagged out and angry. They don't require much of an excuse to kill us all on the spot. On top of all this, they are underfed. If we could keep their bellies filled, we could probably keep them happy and reasonably contented, but I have learned enough about natives to know that if they are hungry, they are neither happy nor contented, even in idleness. If Esteban had not bragged so much about his prowess as a hunter, we should have brought enough provisions to last us through, but now, though we are barely started upon our return journey, we are upon less than half rations." "I can't kill game when there isn't any game," growled the Spaniard. "There is plenty of game," said Kraski the Russian. "We see the tracks of it every day." The Spaniard eyed him venomously. "If there is so much game," he said, "go out and get it yourself." "I never claimed to be a hunter," replied Kraski, "though I could go out with a slingshot and a pea shooter and do as well as you have." The Spaniard leaped to his feet menacingly, and instantly the Russian covered him with a heavy service revolver. "Cut that business," cried the girl, sharply, leaping between them. "Let the blighters fight," growled John Peebles. "If one of 'em kills the hother, there'll be fewer to split the swag, and ere we are in, that's that." "For why should we quarrel?" demanded Bloober. "Dear is enough for all over 40,000 pounds apiece. When you get mad at me, you call me a dirty Jew and say dat I am stingy, but mein Gott, you Christians are worser, you would kill one of your friends to get more money. Oi, oi. Thank God dat I am not a Christian." "Shut up," growled Throck, "or we'll have 43,000 pounds more to divide." Bloober eyed the big Englishman fearfully. Come, Dick," he used in his oiliest tones, "you wouldn't get mad at a leetle choke, would you, on me your best friend?" "I'm sick of all this," Grozen said Throck. "I ain't no highbrow, I ain't nothing but a pug. But I got sense enough to know that Flora's the only one in the bloomin' bunch whose brains wouldn't rattle around in a peanut shell. John Bloober, Kraski, and me. We're here because we could raise the money to carry out Flora's plan. The Dago there," and he indicated Esteban because his face and his figure filled the bill. "There don't any of us need no brains for this work. And there ain't any of us got any more brains than we need. Flora's the brains of this outfit, and the sooner everyone understands that and takes orders from her, the better off we'll all be. She's been to Africa with this Lord Greystoke fella before you was his wife's maid, wasn't you? Flora? And she knows something about the country and the natives and the animals, and there don't none of us know nothin'." "Throck is right," said Kraski quickly. "We've been muddling long enough. We haven't had a boss, and the thing to do is to make Flora boss from now on. If anyone can get us out of this, she can, and from the way those fellows over there are acting." And he nodded toward the blacks. "We'll be lucky if we ever get out with our skins, let alone taking any of the gold with us." "Oi. You don't mean to leave the gold?" almost shrieked Bloober. "I mean that we do whatever Flora thinks best," replied Kraski. "If she says to leave the gold, we'll leave it." "That we do," seconded Throck. "I'm for it," said Peebles. "Whatever Flora says goes." The Spaniard nodded his assent sullenly. "The rest of us are all for it, Bloober." "How about you?" asked Kraski. "Oh, well, sure, if you say so," said Bloober, "und as John says, und here we ain't und what's dat?" "And now," Flora said, "Peebles, you're the big one, what you say goes. What do we do next?" "Very well," said the girl, "we shall camp here until these men are rested, and early tomorrow we'll start out intelligently and systematically, and get meat for them. With their help we can do it. When they are rested and well fed, we will start on again for the coast, moving very slowly, so as not to tire them too much. This is my first plan, but it all hinges upon our ability to get meat. If we do not find it, I shall bury the gold here, and we will do our best to reach the coast as quickly as possible. There we shall recruit new porters, twice as many as we have now, and purchase enough provisions to carry us in and out again. As we come back in, we will cache provisions at every camping place for our return trip, thus saving the necessity of carrying heavy loads all the way in and out again. In this way we can come out light with twice as many porters as we actually need, and by working them in shifts we will travel much faster and there will be no grumbling. These are my two plans. I am not asking you what you think of them because I do not care. You have made me chief and I am going to run this from now on as I think best. Bully for you, roared Peebles. That's the kind of talk I likes to hear. Tell the headman I want to see him, Carl, said the girl, turning to Krasky, and a moment later the Russian returned with a burly Negro. Said the girl as the black halted before her. We are short of food and the men are burdened with loads twice as heavy as they should carry. Tell them that we shall wait here until they are rested, and that tomorrow we shall all go out and hunt for meat. You will send your boys out under 3 good men, and they will act as beaters and drive the game into us. In this way we should get plenty of meat, and when the men are rested and well fed we will move on slowly. Where game is plentiful we will hunt and rest. Tell them that if they do this and we reach the coast in safety and with all our loads, I shall pay them twice what they agreed to come for. Oi, spluttered Bloober, twice what they agreed to come for. Oh, Flora, why not offer them 10%? Would be fine interest on their money. Shut up, you fool, snapped Krasky, and Bloober subsided, though he rocked back and forth, shaking his head in disapproval. The black, who had presented himself for the interview with sullen and scowling demeanor, brightened visibly now. I will tell them, he said, and I think that you will have no more trouble. Good, said Flora, go and tell them now, and the black turned and left. There, said the girl with a sigh of relief, I believe that we can see light ahead at last. Tvice promised to pay them bold Bloober oi. Early the following morning they prepared to set out upon the hunt. The blacks were now smiling and happy in anticipation of plenty of meat, and as they tramped off into the jungle they were singing gaily. Flora had divided them into 3 parties, each under a headman, with explicit directions for the position each party was to take in the line of beaters. Others had been detailed to the whites as gun-bearers, while a small party of the Askari were left behind to guard the camp. The whites, with the exception of Esteban, were armed with rifles. He alone seemed inclined to question Flora's authority, insisting that he preferred to hunt with spear and arrows in keeping with the part he was playing. The fact that, though he had hunted assiduously for weeks, yet had never brought in a single kill, was not sufficient to dampen his egotism. So genuinely had he entered his part that he really thought he was Tarzan of the apes, and with such fidelity had he equipped himself in every detail, and such a master of the art of make-up was he, that, in conjunction with his splendid figure and his handsome face that were almost a counterpart of Tarzan's, it was scarcely to be wondered at that he almost fooled himself as successfully as he had fooled others, for there were men among the carriers who had known the great ape-man. And even these were deceived, though they wondered at the change in him, since in little things he did not deport himself as Tarzan, and in the matter of kills he was disappointing. Flora Hawkes, who was endowed with more than a fair share of intelligence, realized that it would not be well to cross any of her companions unnecessarily, and so she permitted Esteban to hunt that morning in his own way, though some of the others grumbled a little at her decision. What is the difference, she asked them, after the Spaniard had set out alone. The chances are that he could use a rifle no better than he uses his spear and arrows. Carl and Dick are really the only shots among us, and it is upon them we depend principally for the success of our hunt today. Esteban's egotism has been so badly bumped that it is possible that he will go to the last extremity to make a kill today. Let us hope that he is successful. I hope he breaks his fool neck, said Krasky. He has served our purpose, and we would be better off if we were rid of him. The girl shook her head negatively. No, she said, we must not think or speak of anything of that kind. We went into this thing together, let us stick together until the end. If you are wishing that one of us is dead, how do you know that others are not wishing that you were dead? I haven't any doubt but that Miranda wishes I were dead, replied Krasky. I never go to bed at night without thinking that the damned greaser may try to stick a knife into me before morning. And it don't make me feel any kinder toward him to hear you defending him, Flora. You've been a bit soft on him from the start. If I have, it's none of your business, retorted the girl. And so they started out upon their hunt, the Russian scowling and angry, harboring thoughts of vengeance or worse against Esteban, and Esteban, hunting through the jungle, was occupied with his hatred and his jealousy. His dark mind was open to every chance suggestion of a means for putting the other men of the party out of the way, and taking the woman and the gold for himself. He hated them all. In each he saw a possible rival for the affections of Flora, and in the death of each he saw not only one less suitor for the girl's affections, but 43,000 additional pounds to be divided among fewer people. His mind was thus occupied to the exclusion of the business of hunting, which should have occupied him solely when he came through a patch of heavy underbrush, and stepped into the glaring sunlight of a large clearing, face to face with a party of some 50 magnificent ebon warriors. For just an instant Esteban stood frozen in a paralysis of terror, forgetting momentarily the part he was playing, thinking of himself only as a lone white man in the heart of savage Africa, facing a large band of warlike natives, cannibals perhaps. It was that moment of utter silence and inaction that saved him, for as he stood thus before them, the Waziri saw in the silent, majestic figure their beloved lord in a characteristic pose. "Oh, Bwana, Bwana," cried one of the warriors, rushing forward. "It is indeed you, Tarzan of the apes, lord of the jungle, whom we had given up as lost. We, your faithful Waziri, have been searching for you, and even now we were about to dare the dangers of Opar, fearing that you might have ventured there without us, and had been captured." The black, who had at one time accompanied Tarzan to London as a body servant, spoke broken English, an accomplishment of which he was inordinately proud, losing no opportunity to air his attainment before his less fortunate fellows. The fact that it had been he whom fate had chosen to act as spokesman was indeed a fortunate circumstance to Miranda. Although the latter had applied himself assiduously to mastering the dialect of the West Coast carriers, he would have been hard put to it to carry on a conversation with one of them, while he understood nothing of the Waziri tongue. Flora had schooled him carefully and well in the lore of Tarzan, so that he realized now that he was in the presence of a band of the ape-man's faithful Waziri. Never before had he seen such magnificent blacks, clean-cut, powerful men, with intelligent faces and well-molded features, appearing as much higher in the scale of evolution as were the West Coast blacks above the apes. Lucky indeed was Esteban Miranda that he was quick-witted and a consummate actor, otherwise must he have betrayed his terror and his chagrin upon learning that this band of Tarzan's fierce and faithful followers was in this part of the country. For a moment longer he stood in silence before them, gathering his wits, and then he spoke, realizing that his very life depended upon his plausibility. And as he thought, a great light broke upon the shrewd brain of the unscrupulous Spaniard. "Since I last saw you," he said, "I discovered that a party of white men had entered the country for the purpose of robbing the treasure vaults of Opar. I followed them until I found their camp, and then I came in search of you, for there are many of them and they have many ingots of gold, and for they have already been to Opar. Follow me, and we will raid their camp and take the gold from them. Come." And he turned back toward the camp that he had just quitted. As they made their way along the jungle trail, Yusula, the Waziri who had spoken English to him, walked at Esteban's side. Behind them the Spaniard could hear the other warriors speaking in their native tongue, no word of which he understood, and it occurred to him that his position would be most embarrassing should he be addressed in the Waziri language, which of course Tarzan must have understood perfectly. As he listened to the chatter of Yusula, his mind was working rapidly, and presently, as though it were an inspiration, there recurred to him the memory of an accident that had befallen Tarzan, which had been narrated to him by Flora, the story of the injury he had received in the treasure vaults of Opar upon the occasion that he had lost his memory because of a blow upon the head. Esteban wondered if he had committed himself too deeply at first to attribute to amnesia any shortcomings in the portrayal of the role he was acting. At its worst, however, it seemed to him the best that he could do. He turned suddenly upon Yusula. "Do you remember," he asked, "the accident that befell me in the treasure vaults of Opar, depriving me of my memory?" "Yes, Bwana, I remember it well," replied the black. "A similar accident has befallen me," said Esteban. "A great tree fell in my path, and in falling a branch struck me upon the head. It has not caused me to lose my memory entirely, but since then it is with difficulty that I recall many things, and there are others which I must have forgotten entirely, for I do not know your name. Nor do I understand the words that my other Waziri are speaking about me. Ursula looked at him compassionately. Ah, Bwana, sad indeed is the heart of Ursula to hear that this accident has befallen you. Doubtless it will soon pass away as did the other, and in the meantime I, Ursula, will be your memory for you. Good, said Esteban, tell the others that they may understand, and tell them also that I have lost the memory of other things besides. I could not now find my way home without you, and my other senses are dull as well, but as you say, Ursula, it will soon pass off, and I shall be myself again. Your faithful Waziri will rejoice indeed with the coming of that moment, said Ursula. As they approached the camp, Miranda cautioned Ursula to warn his followers to silence, and presently he halted them at the outskirts of the clearing where they could attain a view of the boma and the tents, guarding which was a little band of a half-dozen askari. When they see our greater numbers they will make no resistance, said Esteban. Let us surround the camp, therefore, and at a signal from me we will advance together when you shall address them, saying that Tarzan of the apes comes with his Waziri for the gold they have stolen, but that he will spare them if they will leave the country at once and never return. Had it fulfilled his purpose as well, the Spaniard would have willingly ordered his Waziri to fall upon the men guarding the camp and destroy them all, but to his cunning brain had been born a cleverer scheme. He wanted these men to see him with the Waziri and to live to tell the others that they had seen him, and to repeat to Flora and her followers the thing that Esteban had in his mind to tell one of the askari, while the Waziri were gathering up the gold ingots from the camp. In directing Ursula to station his men about the camp, Esteban had him warn them that they were not to show themselves until he had crept out into the clearing and attracted the attention of the askari on guard. 15 minutes, perhaps, were consumed in stationing his men, and then Ursula returned to Esteban to report that all was ready. When I raise my hand, then you will know that they have recognized me and that you are to advance, Esteban cautioned him, and stepped forward slowly into the clearing. One of the askari saw him and recognized him as Esteban. The Spaniard took a few steps closer to the boma and then halted. I am Tarzan of the apes, he said. Your camp is entirely surrounded by my warriors. Make no move against us and we shall not hurt you. He waved his hand. 50 stalwart Waziri stepped into view from the concealing verdure of the surrounding jungle. The askari eyed them in ill-concealed terror, fingering their rifles nervously. Do not shoot, cautioned Esteban, or we shall slay you all. He approached more closely and his Waziri closed in about him, entirely surrounding the boma. Speak to them, Ursula, said Esteban. The black stepped forward. We are the Waziri, he cried, and this is Tarzan of the apes, lord of the jungle, our master. We have come to recover the gold of Tarzan that you have stolen from the treasure vaults of Opar. This time we shall spare you on condition that you leave the country and never return. Tell this word to your masters. Tell them that Tarzan watches, and that his Waziri watch with him. Lay down your rifles. The askari, glad to escape so easily, complied with the demands of Ursula, and a moment later the Waziri had entered the boma, and at Esteban's direction were gathering up the golden ingots. As they worked, Esteban approached one of the askari, whom he knew spoke broken English. Tell your master, he said, to give thanks for the mercy of Tarzan, who has exacted a toll of but one life for this invasion of his country and theft of his treasure. The creature who presumes to pose as Tarzan I have slain, and his body I shall take away with me and feed to the lions. Tell them that Tarzan forgives even their attempt to poison him upon the occasion that he visited their camp, but only upon the condition that they never return to Africa, and that they divulge the secret of Opar to no others. Tarzan watches and his Waziri watch, and no man may enter Africa without Tarzan's knowledge. Even before they left London I knew that they were coming. Tell them that. It took but a few minutes for the Waziri to gather up the golden ingots, and before the askari had recovered from the surprise of their appearance, they had gone again into the jungle, with Tarzan their master. It was late in the afternoon before Flora and the 4 white men returned from their hunt, surrounded by happy, laughing blacks, bearing the fruits of a successful chase. Now that you are in charge, Flora Kraski was saying, fortune is smiling upon us indeed. We have enough meat here for several days, and with plenty of meat in their bellies they ought to make good progress. I will say it myself. Tings look brighter, said Bloober. Blime, they do that, said Throck. I'm telling you, Flora's a bright one. What the devil is this? Demanded Peebles. What's wrong with them beggars? And he pointed toward the boma, which was now in sight, and from which the askari were issuing at a run, jabbering excitedly as they raced toward them. Tarzan of the apes has been here, they cried excitedly. He has been here with all his Waziri 1,000 great warriors, and though we fought, they overcame us. And taking the gold, they went away. Tarzan of the Apes spoke strange words to me before they left. He said that he had killed one of your number, who had dared to call himself Tarzan of the Apes. We do not understand it. He went away alone to hunt when you went in the morning. And he came back shortly with 1,000 warriors, and he took all the gold, and he threatened to kill us and you, if you ever return to this country again. Vote, cried Bloober de Gold Eyes is gone. Oi, oi. And then they all commenced to ask questions at once until Flora silenced them. Come, she said to the leader of the Askari, we will return to the boma, and then you shall tell me slowly and carefully all that has happened since we left. She listened intently to his narrative, and then questioned him carefully upon various points several times. At last she dismissed him. Then she turned to her confederates. It is all clear to me, she said. Tarzan recovered from the effects of the drug we administered. Then he followed us with his Waziri, caught Esteban and killed him, and, finding the camp, has taken the gold away. We shall be fortunate indeed if we escape from Africa with our lives. Oi, oi, almost shrieked Bloober, the dirty crook. He steals all our gold, and we lose our 2,000 pounds into the bargain. Oi. Oi. Shut up, you dirty Jew, growled Throck. If it hadn't have been for you and the Dago, this air thing would never have happened. With him bragging about his hunting and not being able to kill anything, and you a squeezing every bloomin' ha'penny, we're in a rotten mess that we are. This air a Tarzan bounder, he bumped off Esteban. Which is the best work what he ever done. Too bloody bad you weren't to get it too, and what I got a good mind to do is to slit your throat myself. Stow the guff, Dick roared Peebles. It wasn't nobody's fault, as far as I can see. Instead of talking, what we ought to do is to go after this Tarzan feller and take the bloomin' gold away from him. Flora Hawkes laughed. We haven't a chance in the world, she said. I know this Tarzan bloke. If he was all alone, we wouldn't be a match for him, but he's got a bunch of his Waziri with him. And there are no finer warriors in Africa than they. And they'd fight for him to the last man. You just tell Owaza that you're thinking of going after Tarzan of the Apes and his Waziri to take the gold away from them, and see how long it'd be before we wouldn't have a single nigger with us. The very name of Tarzan scares these West Coast blacks out of a year's growth. They would sooner face the devil. No, sir, we've lost, and all we can do is to get out of the country and thank our lucky stars if we manage to get out alive. The ape man will watch us. I should not be surprised if he were watching us this minute. Her companions looked around apprehensively at this, casting nervous glances toward the jungle, and he'd never let us get back to Opar for another load, even if we could prevail upon our blacks to return there. 2,000 pounds, 2,000 pounds, wailed Bloober. Und all this suit. Vot it cost me 20 guineas vote. I can't veer it again in England, unless I go to a fancy dress ball, which I never do. Krusky had not spoken, but had sat with eyes upon the ground, listening to the others. Now he raised his head. We have lost our gold, he said, and before we get back to England we stand to spend the balance of our 2,000 pounds. In other words, our expedition is a total loss. The rest of you may be satisfied to go back broke, but I am not. There are other things in Africa besides the gold of Opar. And when we leave the country, there is no reason why we shouldn't take something with us that will repay us for our time and investment. What do you mean? Asked Peebles. I have spent a lot of time talking with Owaza, replied Krusky, trying to learn their crazy language, and I have come to find out a lot about the old villain. He's as crooked as they make him, and if he were to be hanged for all his murders, he'd have to have more lives than a cat, but notwithstanding all that, he's a shrewd old fellow. And I've learned a lot more from him than just his monkey talk. I have learned enough, in fact, so that I feel safe in saying that if we stick together, we can go out of Africa with a pretty good-sized stake. Personally, I haven't given up the gold of Opar yet. What we've lost, we've lost. But there's plenty left where that came from, and someday after this blows over, I'm coming back to get my share. But how about this other thing? Asked Flora. How can Owaza help us? There's a little bunch of Arabs down here, explained Krusky, stealing slaves and ivory. Owaza knows where they are working and where their main camp is. There are only a few of them, and their blacks are nearly all slaves who would turn on them in a minute. Now, the idea is this. We have a big enough party to overpower them and take their ivory away from them if we can get their slaves to take our side. We don't want the slaves. We couldn't do anything with them if we had them, so we can promise them their freedom for their help, and give Owaza and his gang a share in the ivory. How do you know Owaza will help us? Asked Flora. The idea is his, that's the reason I know, replied Krusky. It sounds good to me, said Peebles. I ain't for going home empty-handed, and in turn the others signified their approval of the scheme. Chapter 11. Strange incense burns. As Tarzan carried the dead Bolgani from the village of the Gomangani, he set his steps in the direction of the building he had seen from the rim of the valley, the curiosity of the man overcoming the natural caution of the beast. He was traveling upwind, and the odors wafted down to his nostrils told him that he was approaching the habitat of the Bolgani. Intermingled with the scent spoor of the gorilla men was that of Gomangani and the odor of cooked food, and the suggestion of a heavily sweet scent, which the ape-man could connect only with burning incense, though it seemed impossible that such a fragrance could emanate from the dwellings of the Bolgani. Perhaps it came from the great edifice he had seen, a building which must have been constructed by human beings, and in which human beings might still dwell, though never among the multitudinous odors that assailed his nostrils did he once catch the faintest suggestion of the man's scent of whites. When he perceived from the increasing strength of their odor that he was approaching close to the Bolgani, Tarzan took to the trees with his burden, that he might thus stand a better chance of avoiding discovery, and presently, through the foliage ahead, he saw a lofty wall, and beyond, the outlines of the weird architecture of a strange and mysterious pile, outlines that suggested a building of another world, so unearthly were they, and from beyond the wall came the odor of the Bolgani and the fragrance of the incense, intermingled with the scent spoor of Numa, the lion. The jungle was cleared away for 50 feet outside the wall surrounding the building, so that there was no tree overhanging the wall, but Tarzan approached as closely as he could, while still remaining reasonably well concealed by the foliage. He had chosen a point at a sufficient height above the ground to permit him to see over the top of the wall. The building within the enclosure was of great size, its different parts appearing to have been constructed at various periods and each with utter disregard to uniformity, resulting in a conglomeration of connecting buildings and towers, no two of which were alike, though the whole presented a rather pleasing, if somewhat bizarre, appearance. The building stood upon an artificial elevation about 10 feet high, surrounded by a retaining wall of granite, a wide staircase leading to the ground level below. About the building were shrubbery and trees, some of the latter appearing to be of great antiquity, while one enormous tower was almost entirely covered by ivy. By far the most remarkable feature of the building, however, lay in its rich and barbaric ornamentation. Set into the polished granite of which it was composed was an intricate mosaic of gold and diamonds, glittering stones in countless thousands scintillated from facades, minarets, domes, and towers. The enclosure, which comprised some 15 or 20 acres, was occupied for the most part by the building. The terrace upon which it stood was devoted to walks, flowers, shrubs, and ornamental trees, while that part of the area below, which was within the range of Tarzan's vision, seemed to be given over to the raising of garden truck. In the garden and upon the terrace were naked blacks, such as he had seen in the village where he had left L.A. There were both men and women, and these were occupied with the care of growing things within the enclosure. Among them were several of the gorilla-like creatures such as Tarzan had slain in the village, but these performed no labor, devoting themselves rather, it seemed, to directing the work of the blacks, toward whom their manner was haughty and domineering, sometimes even brutal. These gorilla men were trapped in rich ornaments, similar to those upon the body which now rested in a crotch of the tree behind the ape-man. As Tarzan watched with interest the scene below him, 2 Bolgani emerged from the main entrance, a huge portal some 30 feet in width and perhaps 15 feet high. The 2 wore headbands supporting tall, white feathers. As they emerged, they took post on either side of the entrance and, cupping their hands before their mouths, gave voice to a series of shrill cries that bore a marked resemblance to trumpet calls. Immediately the blacks ceased work and hastened to the foot of the stairs descending from the terrace to the garden. Here they formed lines on either side of the stairway, and similarly the Bolgani formed 2 lines upon the terrace from the main portal to the stairway, forming a living aisle from one to the other. Presently from the interior of the building came other trumpet-like calls, and a moment later Tarzan saw the head of a procession emerging. First came 4 Bolgani abreast, each bedecked with an ornate feather headdress, and each carrying a huge bludgeon erect before him. Behind these came 2 trumpeters, and 20 feet behind the trumpeters paced a huge black-maned lion, held in leash by 4 sturdy blacks, 2 upon either side, holding what appeared to be golden chains that ran to a scintillant diamond collar about the beast's neck. Behind the lion marched 20 more Bolgani, 4 abreast. These carried spears, but whether they were for the purpose of protecting the lion from the people or the people from the lion, Tarzan was at a loss to know. The attitude of the Bolgani lining either side of the way between the portal and the stairway indicated extreme deference, for they bent their bodies from their waists in a profound bow while Numa was passing between their lines. When the beast reached the top of the stairway, the procession halted, and immediately the Gomangani ranged below prostrated themselves and placed their foreheads on the ground. Numa, who was evidently an old lion, stood with lordly mien surveying the prostrate humans before him. His evil eyes glared glassily, the while he bared his tusks in a savage grimace, and from his deep lungs rumbled forth an ominous roar, at the sound of which the Gomangani trembled in unfeigned terror. The ape-man knit his brows in thought. Never before had he been called upon to witness so remarkable a scene of the abasement of man before a beast. Presently the procession continued upon its way, descending the staircase and turning to the right along a path through the garden, and when it had passed them, the Gomangani and the Bolgani arose and resumed their interrupted duties. Tarzan remained in his concealment, watching them, trying to discover some explanation for the strange, paradoxical conditions that he had witnessed. The lion with his retinue had turned the far corner of the palace and disappeared from sight. What was he to these people, to these strange creatures? What did he represent? Why this topsy-turvy arrangement of species? Here man ranked lower than the half-beast, and above all, from the deference that had been accorded him, stood a true beast, a savage carnivore. He had been occupied with his thoughts and his observations for some 15 minutes following the disappearance of Numa around the eastern end of the palace, when his attention was attracted to the opposite end of the structure by the sound of other shrill trumpet calls. Turning his eyes in that direction, he saw the procession emerging again into view and proceeding toward the staircase down which they had entered the garden. Immediately the notes of the shrill call sounded upon their ears. The Gomangani and the Bolgani resumed their original positions from below the foot of the staircase to the entrance to the palace, and once again was homage paid to Numa as he made his triumphal entry into the building. Tarzan of the Apes ran his fingers through his mass of tousled hair, but finally he was forced to shake his head in defeat. He could find no explanation whatsoever for all that he had witnessed. His curiosity, however, was so keenly piqued that he determined to investigate the palace and surrounding grounds further before continuing on his way in search of a trail out of the valley. Leaving the body of Bolgani where he had cached it, he started slowly to circle the building that he might examine it from all sides from the concealing foliage of the surrounding forest. He found the architecture equally unique upon all sides, and that the garden extended entirely around the building, though a portion upon the south side of the palace was given over to corrals and pens in which were kept numerous goats and a considerable flock of chickens. Upon this side also were several hundred swinging beehive huts such as he had seen in the native village of the Gomangani. These he took to be the quarters of the black slaves, who performed all the arduous and menial labor connected with the palace. The lofty granite wall which surrounded the entire enclosure was pierced by but a single gate which opened opposite the east end of the palace. This gate was large and of massive construction, appearing to have been built to withstand the assault of numerous and well-armed forces. So strong did it appear that the ape-man could not but harbor the opinion that it had been constructed to protect the interior against forces equipped with heavy battering rams. That such a force had ever existed within the vicinity in historic times seemed most unlikely, and Tarzan conjectured therefore that the wall and the gate were of almost unthinkable antiquity, dating doubtless from the forgotten age of the Atlanteans, and constructed perhaps to protect the builders of the Palace of Diamonds from the well-armed forces that had come from Atlantis to work the gold mines of Opar and to colonize Central Africa. While the wall, the gate, and the palace itself suggested in many ways almost unbelievable age, yet they were in such an excellent state of repair that it was evident that they were still inhabited by rational and intelligent creatures. While upon the south side Tarzan had seen a new tower in process of construction, where a number of blacks working under the direction of Bolgani were cutting and shaping granite blocks and putting them in place. Tarzan had halted in a tree near the east gate to watch the life passing in and out of the palace grounds beneath the ancient portal, and as he watched, a long cavalcade of powerful Gomangani emerged from the forest and entered the enclosure. Swung in hides between two poles, this party was carrying rough-hewn blocks of granite, 4 men to a block. 2 or 3 Bolgani accompanied the long line of carriers, which was preceded and followed by a detachment of black warriors, armed with battle axes and spears. The demeanor and attitude of the black porters, as well as of the Bolgani, suggested to the ape-man nothing more nor less than a caravan of donkeys, plodding their stupid way at the behest of their drivers. If one lagged, he was prodded with the point of a spear or struck with its haft. There was no greater brutality shown than in the ordinary handling of beasts of burden the world around, nor in the demeanor of the blacks was there any more indication of objection or revolt than you see depicted upon the faces of a long line of burden-bearing mules. And to all intents and purposes they were dumb, driven cattle. Slowly they filed through the gateway and disappeared from sight. A few moments later, another party came out of the forest and passed into the palace grounds. This consisted of fully 50 armed Bolgani and twice as many black warriors with spears and axes. Entirely surrounded by these armed creatures were 4 brawny porters carrying a small litter, upon which was fastened an ornate chest about 2 feet wide by 4 feet long, with a depth of approximately 2 feet. The chest itself was of some dark, weather-worn wood, and was reinforced by bands and corners of what appeared to be virgin gold in which were set many diamonds. What the chest contained Tarzan could not, of course, conceive, but that it was considered of great value was evidenced by the precautions for safety with which it had been surrounded. The chest was borne directly into the huge ivy-covered tower at the northeast corner of the palace, the entrance to which, Tarzan now first observed, was secured by doors as large and heavy as the east gate itself. At the first opportunity that he could seize to accomplish it undiscovered, Tarzan swung across the jungle trail and continued through the trees to that one in which he had left the body of the Bolgani. Throwing this across his shoulder, he returned to a point close above the trail near the east gate, and seizing upon a moment when there was a lull in the traffic, he hurled the body as close to the portal as possible. Now, thought the ape-man, let them guess who slew their fellow if they can. Making his way toward the southeast, Tarzan approached the mountains which lie back of the valley of the Palace of Diamonds. He had often to make detours to avoid native villages and to keep out of sight of the numerous parties of Bolgani that seemed to be moving in all directions through the forest. Late in the afternoon he came out of the hills into full view of the mountains beyond rough granite hills they were, whose precipitous peaks arose far above the timberline. Directly before him a well-marked trail led into a canyon, which he could see wound far upward toward the summit. This, then, would be as good a place to commence his investigations as another, and so seeing that the coast was clear, the ape-man descended from the trees and, taking advantage of the underbrush bordering the trail, made his way silently yet swiftly into the hills. For the most part he was compelled to worm his way through thickets, for the trail was in constant use by Gomangani and Bolgani, parties passing up it empty-handed and returning bearing blocks of granite. As he advanced more deeply into the hills, the heavy underbrush gave way to a lighter growth of scrub, through which he could pass with far greater ease, though with considerable more risk of discovery. However, the instinct of the beast that dominated Tarzan's jungle craft permitted him to find cover where another would have been in full view of every enemy. Halfway up the mountain, the trail passed through a narrow gorge, not more than 20 feet wide and eroded from solid granite cliffs. Here there was no concealment whatsoever, and the ape-man realized that to enter it would mean almost immediate discovery. Glancing about, he saw that by making a slight detour he could reach the summit of the gorge, where, amid tumbled granite boulders and stunted trees and shrubs, he knew that he could find sufficient concealment, and perhaps a plainer view of the trail beyond. Nor was he mistaken, for, when he had reached a vantage point far above the trail, he saw ahead an open pocket in the mountain, the cliffs surrounding which were honeycombed with numerous openings, which it seemed to Tarzan could be naught else than the mouths of tunnels. Rough wooden ladders reached to some of them closer to the base of the cliffs, while from others knotted ropes dangled to the ground below. Out of these tunnels emerged men carrying little sacks of earth, which they dumped in a common pile beside a rivulet which ran through the gorge. Here other blacks, supervised by Bolgani, were engaged in washing the dirt, but what they hoped to find or what they did find, Tarzan could not guess. Along one side of the rocky basin, many other blacks were engaged in quarrying the granite from the cliffs, which had been cut away through similar operations into a series of terraces running from the floor of the basin to the summit of the cliff. Here naked blacks toiled with primitive tools under the supervision of savage Bolgani. The activities of the quarrymen were obvious enough, but what the others were bringing from the mouths of the tunnels Tarzan could not be positive, though the natural assumption was that it was gold. Where, then, did they obtain their diamonds? Certainly not from these solid granite cliffs. A few minutes' observation convinced Tarzan that the trail he had followed from the forest ended in this little cul-de-sac, and so he sought a way upward and around it, in search of a pass across the range. The balance of that day and nearly all the next he devoted to his efforts in this direction, only in the end to be forced to admit that there was no egress from the valley upon this side. To points far above the timberline he made his way, but there always he came face to face with sheer, perpendicular cliffs of granite towering high above him, upon the face of which not even the ape-man could find foothold. Along the southern and eastern sides of the basin he carried his investigation, but with similar disappointing results, and then at last he turned his steps back toward the forest with the intention of seeking a way out through the valley of Opar with L.A., after darkness had fallen. The sun had just risen when Tarzan arrived at the native village in which he had left L.A., and no sooner did his eyes rest upon it than he became apprehensive that something was amiss, for not only was the gate wide open, but there was no sign of life within the palisade. Nor was there any movement of the swinging huts that would indicate that they were occupied. Always wary of ambush, Tarzan reconnoitered carefully before descending into the village. To his trained observation it became evident that the village had been deserted for at least 24 hours. Running to the hut in which Lay had been hidden, he hastily ascended the rope and examined the interior. It was vacant, nor was there any sign of the high priestess. Descending to the ground, the ape-man started to make a thorough investigation of the village in search of clues to the fate of its inhabitants and of L.A. He had examined the interiors of several huts when his keen eyes noted a slight movement of one of the swinging, cage-like habitations some distance from him. Quickly he crossed the intervening space, and as he approached the hut he saw that no rope trailed from its doorway. Halting beneath, Tarzan raised his face to the aperture, through which nothing but the roof of the hut was visible. "Gomangani," he cried, "it is I, Tarzan of the Apes. Come to the opening and tell me what has become of your fellows and of my mate, whom I left here under the protection of your warriors." There was no answer, and again Tarzan called, for he was positive that someone was hiding in the hut. "Come down," he called again, "or I will come up after you." Still there was no reply. A grim smile touched the ape-man's lips as he drew his hunting knife from its sheath and placed it between his teeth, and then, with a cat-like spring, leapt for the opening, and catching its sides, drew his body up into the interior of the hut. If he had expected opposition, he met with none, nor in the dimly lighted interior could he at first distinguish any presence, though, when his eyes became accustomed to the semi-darkness, he descried a bundle of leaves and grasses lying against the opposite wall of the structure. Crossing to these, he tore them aside, revealing the huddled form of a terrified woman. Seizing her by a shoulder, he drew her to a sitting position. "What has happened?" he demanded. "Where are the villagers? Where is my mate?" "Do not kill me. Do not kill me," she cried. "It was not I. It was not my fault." "I do not intend to kill you," replied Tarzan. "Tell me the truth and you shall be safe." "The Bolgani have taken them away," cried the woman. "They came when the sun was low upon the day that you arrived, and they were very angry, for they had found the body of their fellow outside the gate of the Palace of Diamonds. They knew that he had come here to our village, and no one had seen him alive since he had departed from the palace. They came then and threatened and tortured our people, until at last the warriors told them all. I hid. I do not know why they did not find me, but at last they went away, taking all the others with them, taking your mate. Too, they will never come back." "You think that the Bolgani will kill them?" asked Tarzan. "Yes," she replied, "they kill all who displease them." Alone now and relieved of the responsibility of L.A., Tarzan might easily make his way by night through the valley of Opar and to safety beyond the barrier, but perhaps such a thought never entered his head. Gratitude and loyalty were marked characteristics of the ape-man. La had saved him from the fanaticism and intrigue of her people. She had saved him at a cost of all that was most dear to her: power and position, peace and safety. She had jeopardized her life for him and become an exile from her own country. The mere fact then that the Bolgani had taken her with the possible intention of slaying her was not sufficient for the ape-man. He must know whether or not she lived, and if she lived he must devote his every energy to winning her release and her eventual escape from the dangers of this valley. Tarzan spent the day reconnoitering outside the palace grounds, seeking an opportunity of gaining entrance without detection, but this he found impossible, inasmuch as there was never a moment that there were not Gomangani or Bolgani in the outer garden. But with the approach of darkness the great east gate was closed, and the inmates of the huts and palace withdrew within their walls, leaving not even a single sentinel without a fact that indicated clearly that the Bolgani had no reason to apprehend an attack. The subjugation of the Gomangani then was apparently complete, and so the towering walls surrounding their palace, which was more than sufficient to protect them from the inroads of lions, was but the reminder of an ancient day when a once powerful but now vanished enemy threatened their peace and safety. When darkness had finally settled, Tarzan approached the gate, and throwing the noose of his grass rope over one of the carved lions that capped the gate posts, ascended quickly to the summit of the wall, from where he dropped lightly into the garden below. And to ensure an avenue for quick escape in the event that he found LA, he unlatched the heavy gates and swung them open. Then he crept stealthily toward the ivy-covered east tower, which he had chosen after a day of investigation as offering easiest ingress to the palace. The success of his plan hinged largely upon the age and strength of the ivy, which grew almost to the summit of the tower, and to his immense relief he found that it would easily support his weight. Far above the ground, near the summit of the tower, he had seen from the trees surrounding the palace an open window, which, unlike the balance of those in this part of the palace, was without bars. Dim lights shone from several of the tower windows, as from those of other parts of the palace. Avoiding these lighted apertures, Tarzan ascended quickly, though carefully, toward the unbarred window above, and as he reached it and cautiously raised his eyes above the level of the sill, he was delighted to find that it opened into an unlighted chamber, the interior of which, however, was so shrouded in darkness that he could discern nothing within. Drawing himself carefully to the level of the sill, he crept quietly into the apartment beyond. Groping through the blackness, he cautiously made the rounds of the room, which he found to contain a carved bedstead of peculiar design, a table, and a couple of benches. Upon the bedstead were stuffs of woven material, thrown over the softly tanned pelts of antelopes and leopards. Opposite the window through which he had entered was a closed door. This he opened slowly and silently, until through a tiny aperture he could look out upon a dimly lighted corridor or circular hallway, in the center of which was an opening about 4 feet in diameter, passing through which and disappearing beyond a similar opening in the ceiling directly above was a straight pole with short crosspieces fastened to it at intervals of about a foot, quite evidently the primitive staircase which gave communication between the various floors of the tower. 3 upright columns, set at equal intervals about the circumference of the circular opening in the center of the floor, helped to support the ceiling above. Around the outside of this circular hallway there were other doors, similar to that opening into the apartment in which he was. Hearing no noise and seeing no evidence of another than himself, Tarzan opened the door and stepped into the hallway. His nostrils were now assailed strongly by the same heavy fragrance of incense that had first greeted him upon his approach to the palace several days before. In the interior of the tower, however, it was much more powerful, practically obliterating all other odors and placing upon the ape-man an almost prohibitive handicap in his search for LA. In fact, as he viewed the doors upon this single stage of the tower, he was filled with consternation at the prospect of the well-nigh impossible task that confronted him. To search this great tower alone, without any assistance whatever from his keen sense of scent, seemed impossible of accomplishment if he were to take even the most ordinary precautions against detection. The ape-man's self-confidence was in no measure blundering egotism. Knowing his limitations, he knew that he would have little or no chance against even a few Bolgani were he to be discovered within their palace, where all was familiar to them and strange to him. Behind him was the open window, and the silent jungle night and freedom. Ahead danger, predestined failure, and quite likely death. Which should he choose? For a moment he stood in silent thought, and then raising his head and squaring his great shoulders, he shook his black locks defiantly and stepped boldly toward the nearest door. Room after room he had investigated until he had made the entire circle of the landing, but in so far as Lay or any clue to her were concerned, his search was fruitless. He found quaint furniture and rugs and tapestries and ornaments of gold and diamonds, and in one dimly lighted chamber he came upon a sleeping Bolgani, but so silent were the movements of the ape-man that the sleeper slept on undisturbed, even though Tarzan passed entirely around his bed, which was set in the center of the chamber, and investigated a curtained alcove beyond. Having completed the rounds of this floor, Tarzan determined to work upward first and then, returning, investigate the lower stages later. Pursuant to this plan, therefore, he ascended the strange stairway. 3 landings he passed before he reached the upper floor of the tower. Circling each floor was a ring of doors, all of which were closed, while dimly lighting each landing were feebly burning cressets, shallow, golden bowls containing what appeared to be tallow, in which floated a tow-like wick. Upon the upper landing there were but 3 doors, all of which were closed. The ceiling of this hallway was the dome-like roof of the tower, in the center of which was another circular opening, through which the stairway protruded into the darkness of the night above. As Tarzan opened the door nearest him, it creaked upon its hinges, giving forth the first audible sound, that had resulted from his investigations up to this point. The interior of the apartment before him was unlighted, and as Tarzan stood there in the entrance in statuesque silence for a few seconds following the creaking of the hinge, he was suddenly aware of movement of the faintest shadow of a sound behind him. Wheeling quickly, he saw the figure of a man standing in an open doorway upon the opposite side of the landing. Chapter 12. The Golden Ingots. Esteban Miranda had played the role of Tarzan of the Apes with the Waziri as his audience for less than 24 hours when he began to realize that, even with the leeway that his supposedly injured brain gave him, it was going to be a very difficult thing to carry on the deception indefinitely. In the first place, Ursula did not seem at all pleased at the idea of merely taking the gold away from the intruders and then running from them. Nor did his fellow warriors seem any more enthusiastic over the plan than he. As a matter of fact, they could not conceive that any number of bumps upon the head could render their Tarzan of the Apes a coward, and to run away from these West Coast blacks and a handful of inexperienced whites seemed nothing less than cowardly. Following all this, there had occurred in the afternoon that which finally decided the Spaniard that he was building for himself anything other than a bed of roses, and that the sooner he found an excuse for quitting the company of the Waziri, the greater would be his life expectancy. They were passing through rather open jungle at the time. The brush was not particularly heavy, and the trees were at considerable distances apart, when suddenly, without warning, a rhinoceros charged them. To the consternation of the Waziri, Tarzan of the Apes turned and fled for the nearest tree the instant his eyes alighted upon charging Buto. In his haste, Esteban tripped and fell, and when at last he reached the tree, instead of leaping agilely into the lower branches, he attempted to shin up the huge bole, as a schoolboy shins up a telegraph pole, only to slip and fall back again to the ground. In the meantime, Buto, who charges either by scent or hearing rather than by eyesight, his powers of which are extremely poor, had been distracted from his original direction by one of the Waziri, and after missing the fellow had gone blundering on to disappear in the underbrush beyond. When Esteban finally arose and discovered that the rhinoceros was gone, he saw surrounding him a semicircle of huge blacks, upon whose faces were written expressions of pity and sorrow, not unmingled, in some instances, with a tinge of contempt. The Spaniard saw that he had been terrified into a practically irreparable blunder, yet he seized despairingly upon the only excuse he could conjure up. "My poor head," he cried, pressing both palms to his temples. "The blow was upon your head," Bwana said Ursula, "and your faithful Waziri thought that it was the heart of their master that knew no fear." Esteban made no reply, and in silence they resumed their march. In silence they continued until they made camp before dark upon the bank of the river just above a waterfall. During the afternoon, Esteban had evolved a plan of escape from his dilemma, and no sooner had he made camp than he ordered the Waziri to bury the treasure. "We shall leave it here," he said, "and tomorrow we shall set forth in search of the thieves, for I have decided to punish them. They must be taught that they may not come into the jungle of Tarzan with impunity. It was only the injury to my head that prevented me from slaying them immediately I discovered their perfidy." This attitude pleased the Waziri better. They commenced to see a ray of hope. Once again was Tarzan of the Apes becoming Tarzan. And so it was that, with lighter hearts and a new cheerfulness, they set forth the next morning in search of the camp of the Englishmen. And by shrewd guessing on Ursula's part, they cut across the jungle to intercept the probable line of march of the Europeans to such advantage that they came upon them just as they were making camp that night. Long before they reached them, they smelled the smoke of their fires and heard the songs and chatter of the West Coast carriers. Then it was that Esteban gathered the Waziri about him. "My children," he said, addressing Ursula in English, "these strangers have come here to wrong Tarzan. To Tarzan then belongs the vengeance. Go therefore and leave me to punish my enemies alone and in my own way. Return home, leave the gold where it is, for it will be a long time before I shall need it." The Waziri were disappointed, for this new plan did not at all accord with their desires, which contemplated a cheerful massacre of the West Coast blacks. But as yet the man before them was Tarzan, their big Bwana, to whom they had never failed in implicit obedience. For a few moments following Esteban's declaration of his intention, they stood in silence, shifting uneasily, and then at last they commenced to speak to one another in Waziri. What they said the Spaniard did not know, but evidently they were urging something upon Ursula, who presently turned toward him. "Oh, Bwana," cried the black, "how can we return home to the Lady Jane and tell her that we left you injured and alone to face the rifles of the white men and their askari? Do not ask us to do it, Bwana. If you were yourself, we should not fear for your safety, but since the injury to your head, you have not been the same. And we fear to leave you alone in the jungle. Let us then, your faithful Waziri, punish these people, after which we will take you home in safety, where you may be cured of the evils that have fallen upon you." The Spaniard laughed. "I am entirely recovered," he said, "and I am in no more danger alone than I would be with you," which he knew, even better than they, was but a mild statement of the facts. "You will obey my wishes," he continued sternly. "Go back at once the way that we have come. After you have gone at least 2 miles, you may make camp for the night, and in the morning start out again for home. Make no noise. I do not want them to know that I am here. Do not worry about me. I am all right. And I shall probably overtake you before you reach home. Go." Sorrowfully the Waziri turned back upon the trail they had just covered, and a moment later the last of them disappeared from the sight of the Spaniard. With a sigh of relief, Esteban Miranda turned toward the camp of his own people. Fearing that to surprise them suddenly might invite a volley of shots from the askari, he whistled, and then called aloud as he approached. "It is Tarzan," cried the first of the blacks who saw him. "Now indeed shall we all be killed." Esteban saw the growing excitement among the carriers and askari. He saw the latter seize their rifles and that they were fingering the triggers nervously. "It is I, Esteban Miranda," he called aloud. "Flora, Flora, tell those fools to lay aside their rifles." The whites, too, were standing watching him, and at the sound of his voice Flora turned toward the blacks. "It is all right," she said. "That is not Tarzan. Lay aside your rifles." Esteban entered the camp, smiling. "Here I am," he said. "We thought that you were dead," said Krasky. "Some of these fellows said that Tarzan said that he had killed you." "He captured me," said Esteban, "but as you see, he did not kill me. I thought that he was going to, but he did not, and finally he turned me loose in the jungle. He may have thought that I could not survive and that he would accomplish his end just as surely without having my blood upon his hands." "You must have knowed," you said Peebles. "You'd die, all right. If you were left alone very long in the jungle, you'd starve to death." Esteban made no reply to the sally but turned toward Flora. "Are you not glad to see me, Flora?" he asked. The girl shrugged her shoulders. "What is the difference?" she asked. "Our expedition is a failure. Some of them think you were largely to blame." She nodded her head in the general direction of the other whites. The Spaniard scowled. None of them cared very much to see him. He did not care about the others, but he had hoped that Flora would show some enthusiasm about his return. Well, if she had known what he had in his mind, she might have been happier to see him, and only too glad to show some kind of affection. But she did not know that Esteban Miranda had hidden the golden ingots where he might go another day and get them. It had been his intention to persuade her to desert the others, and then later the two would return and recover the treasure, but now he was piqued and offended. None of them should have a shilling of it. He would wait until they left Africa, and then he would return and take it all for himself. The only fly in the ointment was the thought that the Waziri knew the location of the treasure, and that, sooner or later, they would return with Tarzan and get it. This weak spot in his calculations must be strengthened, and to strengthen it, he must have assistance, which would mean sharing his secret with another, but whom? Outwardly oblivious of the sullen glances of his companions, he took his place among them. It was evident to him that they were far from being glad to see him, but just why he did not know, for he had not heard of the plan that Krasky and Oaza had hatched to steal the loot of the ivory raiders, and that their main objection to his presence was the fear that they would be compelled to share the loot with him. It was Krasky who first voiced the thought that was in the minds of all but Esteban. "Miranda," he said, "it is the consensus of opinion that you and Blueber are largely responsible for the failure of our venture. We are not finding fault. I just mention it as a fact. But since you have been away, we have struck upon a plan to take something out of Africa that will partially recompense us for the loss of the gold. We have worked the thing all out carefully and made our plans. We don't need you to carry them out. We have no objection to your coming along with us if you want to for company. But we want to have it understood from the beginning that you are not to share in anything that we get out of this." The Spaniard smiled and waved a gesture of unconcern. "It is perfectly all right," he said. "I shall ask for nothing. I would not wish to take anything from any of you." And he grinned inwardly as he thought of the more than £250,000 in gold which he would one day take out of Africa for himself, alone. At this unexpected attitude of acquiescence upon Esteban's part, the others were greatly relieved, and immediately the entire atmosphere of constraint was removed. "You're a good fellow, Esteban," said Peebles. I've been saying right along that you'd want to do the right thing, and I want to say that I'm mighty glad to see you back here safe and sound. I felt terrible when I heard you was croaked, that I did." "Yes," said Bloober. "John, he feels so bad he cry himself to sleep every night. Ain't it, John?" "Don't try to start nothin'," Bloober growled Peebles, glaring at the Jew. "I wasn't commencing to start nodding," replied Adolphe, seeing that the big Englishman was angry. "Of course, we are all sorry dat vi Tio Esteban was killed, and we is all glad dot he is back. And that he don't want any of the swag," added Throck. "Don't worry," said Esteban. "If I get back to London, I'll be happy enough. I've had enough of Africa to last me all the rest of my life." Before he could get to sleep that night, the Spaniard spent a wakeful hour or two trying to evolve a plan whereby he might secure the gold absolutely to himself, without fear of its being removed by the Waziri later. He knew that he could easily find the spot where he had buried it and remove it to another close by, provided that he could return immediately over the trail along which Usula had led them that day, and he could do this alone, ensuring that no one but himself would know the new location of the hiding place of the gold. But he was equally positive that he could never again return later from the coast and find where he had hidden it. This meant that he must share his secret with another one familiar with the country who could find the spot again at any time and from any direction, but who was there whom he might trust. In his mind he went carefully over the entire personnel of their safari, and continually his mind reverted to a single individual, Awaza. He had no confidence in the wily old scoundrel's integrity, but there was no other who suited his purpose as well, and finally he was forced to the conclusion that he must share his secret with this black, and depend upon avarice rather than honor for his protection. He could repay the fellow well, make him rich beyond his wildest dreams, and this the Spaniard could well afford to do in view of the tremendous fortune at stake. And so he fell asleep dreaming of what gold, to the value of over £250,000 sterling, would accomplish in the gay capitals of the world. The following morning, while they were breakfasting, Esteban mentioned casually that he had passed a large herd of antelope not far from their camp the previous day, and suggested that he take 4 or 5 men and do a little hunting, joining the balance of the party at camp that night. No one raised any objection, possibly for the reason that they assumed that the more he hunted and the further from the safari he went, the greater the chances of his being killed, a contingency that none of them would have regretted, since at heart they had neither liking nor trust for him. "I will take Awaza," he said. "He is the cleverest hunter of them all, and 5 or 6 men of his choosing." But later, when he approached Awaza, the black interposed objections to the hunt. "We have plenty of meat for 2 days," he said. "Let us go on as fast as we can, away from the land of the Waziri and Tarzan. I can find plenty of game anywhere between here and the coast. March for 2 days, and then I will hunt with you." "Listen," said Esteban, in a whisper. "It is more than antelope that I would hunt. I cannot tell you here in camp, but when we have left the others I will explain. It will pay you better to come with me today than all the ivory you can hope to get from the raiders." Awaza cocked an attentive ear and scratched his woolly head. "It is a good day to hunt, Bwana," he said. "I will come with you and bring 5 boys." After Awaza had planned the march for the main party and arranged for the camping place for the night so that he and the Spaniard could find them again, the hunting party set out upon the trail that Usula had followed from the buried treasure the preceding day. They had not gone far before Awaza discovered the fresh spoor of the Waziri. "Many men passed here late yesterday," he said to Esteban, eyeing the Spaniard quizzically. "I saw nothing of them," replied the latter. "They must have come this way after I passed. They came almost to our camp, and then they turned about and went away again," said Awaza. "Listen, Bwana, I carry a rifle and you shall march ahead of me. If these tracks were made by your people, and you are leading me into ambush, you shall be the first to die." "Listen, Awaza," said Esteban, "we are far enough from camp now so that I may tell you all. These tracks were made by the Waziri of Tarzan of the Apes, who buried the gold for me a day's march from here. I have sent them home, and I wish you to go back with me and move the gold to another hiding place. After these others have gotten their ivory and returned to England, you and I will come back and get the gold, and then indeed shall you be well rewarded." "Who are you?" then asked Awaza. "Often have I doubted that you are Tarzan of the Apes. The day that we left the camp outside of Opar, one of my men told me that you had been poisoned by your own people and left in the camp. He said that he saw it with his own eyes, your body lying hidden behind some bushes, and yet you were with us upon the march that day. I thought that he lied to me, but I saw the consternation in his face when he saw you, and so I have often wondered if there were two Tarzans of the apes." "I am not Tarzan of the apes," said Esteban. "It was Tarzan of the apes who was poisoned in our camp by the others, but they only gave him something that would put him to sleep for a long time, possibly with the hope that he would be killed by wild animals before he awoke. Whether or not he still lives we do not know. Therefore you have nothing to fear from the Waziri or Tarzan on my account, O Waza, for I want to keep out of their way even more than you." The black nodded. "Perhaps you speak the truth," he said, but still he walked behind with his rifle always ready in his hand. They went warily for fear of overtaking the Waziri, but shortly after passing the spot where the latter had camped they saw that they had taken another route, and that there was now no danger of coming in contact with them. When they had reached a point within about a mile of the spot where the gold had been buried, Esteban told Owaza to have his boys remain there while they went ahead alone to effect the transfer of the ingots. "The fewer who know of this," he said to the black, "the safer we shall be." "The Bwana speaks words of wisdom," replied the wily black. Esteban found the spot near the waterfall without difficulty, and upon questioning Owaza he discovered that the latter knew the location perfectly and would have no difficulty in coming directly to it again from the coast. They transferred the gold but a short distance, concealing it in a heavy thicket near the edge of the river, knowing that it would be as safe from discovery there as though they had transported it 100 miles. For the chances were extremely slight that the Waziri or anyone else who should learn of its original hiding place would imagine that anyone would go to the trouble of removing it, but a matter of 100 yards. When they had finished, Owaza looked at the sun. "We will never reach camp tonight," he said, "and we will have to travel fast to overtake them even tomorrow." "I did not expect to," replied Esteban, "but I could not tell them that. If we never find them again, I shall be satisfied." Owaza grinned. In his crafty mind an idea was formed. Why, he thought, risk death in a battle with the Arab ivory raiders on the chance of securing a few tusks, when all this gold awaits only transportation to the coast to be ours? Tarzan saw a white man, bald and old and shriveled with a long white beard,